Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ali Vitale in Washington. As the president-elect's government efficiency team of Elon, Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy spent the day on Capitol Hill. Musk had one of his children in tow as the two entrepreneurs pitched lawmakers on their new Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, and its massive push for reforms and sweeping cuts to government spending and personnel. Now, to be clear, DOGE is not a new government agency. It has no statutory authority, but if its recommendations are able to win over enough members of Congress or the president himself, its work could make some serious waves in Washington. Musk and Ramaswamy have already laid out some ambitious goals for DOGE, like finding ways to cut $2 trillion from the federal budget, massive cuts for the federal workforce, and the elimination of independent agencies like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Republican senators emerged from their meetings with open minds, saying they're receptive to the initial ideas floated by Musk and Ramaswamy today.
I think there's a lot of excitement, and he's very knowledgeable and open to suggestions. He came to listen, and I came to listen, so it was a good session.
I think we're just exchanging ideas right now, and you've got a group of reform-minded people. So I'm excited about the opportunities that lie ahead.
This is the very beginning of a process that, if we do it right, will be ongoing. So now we're just talking about the art of the possible, kind of the metes and bounds of things that we can do quickly, things that will take a longer time, require enabling legislation. But it was a good discussion.
And on the House side, Speaker Mike Johnson appeared equally eager to work with the DOGE Commission.
This is a brainstorming session. It is the first, again, as I said, of a long series of meetings that will be held as we're laying the groundwork for the new year and the new Congress. And you're going to see a lot of change around here and in Washington and the way things are run.
But there's some serious skepticism surrounding DOGE's work. Will members of Congress be as positive about spending cuts if they impact their own districts? Is any major piece of legislation going to be able to get through this closely divided Congress? And there are serious conflict of interest issues at stake as well, as Elon Musk's companies rake in billions of dollars in federal contracts. But DOGE isn't just looking to Congress. My CNBC colleague Eamon Javers sat down with Vivek Ramaswamy yesterday, part of CNBC's CFO Council Summit, and Ramaswamy made it clear that he's hoping the president-elect will act on DOGE's recommendations if Congress doesn't listen.
I think that there is an environment where people who are in Congress now, including those who have been elected, but also many who have been fighting this fight for a long time, feel like now is the moment where they've been given the ability to do what they haven't really had the license to do in the past.
Until it comes to their district.
But that being said, I think that ignores what can be done through the executive branch already. The executive branch has no obligation to send out a payment if it is wasteful or if it is known to be fraudulent or has a reason to believe that there is error associated with that payment.
Joining me now, my colleague on Capitol Hill, Ryan Nobles, who's waiting outside of that House meeting, NBC's Garrett Haake covering all things Trump transition, and CNBC's senior Washington correspondent, Eamon Javers. Ryan, we'll start with you. This is the first time we've seen the DOGE Commission on the Hill. I know Republicans are bought in, but to what degree is this a one-sided effort? Because I know a handful of Democrats who are interested, too.
Yeah, well, the first answer to that question, Ali, is that this is a room in which Ramaswamy and Elon Musk are entertaining a brainstorming session, and there's not a single Democrat in that room, despite the fact that several Democrats have raised their hand and said that they'd like to be a part of these DOGE caucuses in both the House and the Senate, and some have even said that they'd wish that they'd gotten an invite to this meeting. So it's not off to a good start in terms of the bipartisan nature of all of this. But that doesn't mean that at some point along the way, they might try and include Democrats. And there are plenty of Democrats on Capitol Hill who agree with Republicans that federal spending is out of control and that there needs to be reform. But as what always happens, when you get into a conversation about spending in Washington, everyone loves the idea of cutting spending. But then when you actually put those spending cuts next to actual real policy, then all of a sudden the conversation changes. For instance, yesterday, Bernie Sanders said he'd be all in favor of massive cuts to the Pentagon's budget. Well, there's probably a lot of Republicans in that room that probably don't feel the same way. So this is going to be an ongoing process. There's a lot of back and forth. There's optimism here. There's a lot of people who believe that this is a necessary thing, that Washington needs to have this kind of gut check every once in a while, and perhaps this is a positive effort. But they've got a lot of work to do before we see any sort of substantive reality emerge from this new commission.
Yeah, certainly that's right. In the conversations I was having this morning with senators, I heard very few specifics. But the other way that Washington works is that Congress holds the power of the purse. When I was out in the halls today, there were senators who seemed fine with the executive branch sort of taking the reins here and jumping into the government funding space. But does that start to change when this commission begins targeting some of these own lawmakers' pet projects in their districts as part of the larger efficiency effort?
Yeah, I think part of this is maybe a fundamental misunderstanding of how the federal budget works.
Right.
I just talked to Congressman Greg Steube of Florida, who he believes that a lot of these cuts can be done by just not spending existing money that's already been appropriated. I don't know if that gets you to $2 trillion in 1 year. I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but my guess is that you really can't get to $2 trillion in cuts without taking a serious look at entitlement programs and a serious look at the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense makes up 18% of the federal budget. The Social Security Administration, 21% of the federal budget. If you're looking at $2 trillion in cuts in a $6 trillion budget, there's no possible way you can get to that number without getting into those two specific agencies themselves. It won't be enough just to get rid of funds that you believe are misappropriated. But to your point, Allie, there does seem to be a degree of acceptance from many rank and file Republicans that Trump can just cut whatever he wants and we'll just let it happen. And this is, again, another example of the ceding of authority by the legislative branch to the executive branch that we've seen slowly build up with both Republicans and Democrats over the past couple of presidential cycles. But the power of the purse is perhaps Congress's most important authority. And if they're willing to just cede that to the executive branch, well, that may be a difficult power to recoup later on. And the other point is that they just may not be able to do so constitutionally.
Yeah, and we'll get to Eamon in just one moment, who tried to count to $2 trillion when he was interviewing Ramaswamy. But Garrett, I'll go first to you. This commission isn't even an actual government agency. So do they have a plan on how to enforce their recommendations? And what even are those recommendations at this point?
Well, I think the word on the street is concepts of a plan,
right,
Allie,
sure,
the phrase
yeah.
we've all become familiar with here. I mean, no, look, the DOJ folks here are essentially outside consultants who will be brought into each of these agencies with their own ideas. But the actual levers of how this all works, as you and Ryan both know, is that Congress has to spend this money, and they're going to do so likely, at least for the foreseeable future, with CRs, continuing resolutions, which locks in the same amount of spending that they've done year after year. I mean, there's a reason why this kind of work hasn't been successful in the past. It's extremely challenging. And I think the other sort of basic data point to consider here is that Donald Trump has been president before for 4 years and showed effectively no real interest in stopping the kind of spending that they're talking about now. He wasn't interested in deficits. He wasn't particularly interested in curtailing the debt. And he didn't roll back spending. He just had different spending priorities. And so I think when I hear Mike Johnson talk about a long list of meetings and brainstorming sessions, I think what we may be seeing here is a bunch of Republican lawmakers who want to get caught trying to talk about the thing that Donald Trump and his self-described first buddy, Elon Musk, care a great deal about right now, but may not still have a lot of enthusiasm behind it once the appropriating process resumes in earnest next year.
Tell me you came up in the school of Chuck Todd without telling me by saying get caught trying there, Garrett, because that's something that Chuck often says. But really, are the optics more important than the outcome? Is it important for Trump to be able to go on the road and say the DOJ Commission exists, even if it's not actually doing anything?
Yeah, I think that's entirely possible, and I think it gives two of his most vocal and kind of hard to place elsewhere in the federal government supporters in Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, who both have a lot of influence and a lot of conflicts of interest, which would make it almost impossible for them to have a more traditional role, something to do and some way to direct their megaphones back at the issues that Trump and his base say they care a great deal about. But I think at the end of the day, cutting government spending is not in the top 5 things that Trump ran on and won on in 2024. And I don't expect this to be the kind of thing that has a lot of legs in the new year.
Garrett, Ryan, thank you both so much for joining. Ryan, keep your running shoes on. You got to run after Elon Musk, I'm sure. Eamon, you and I are now going to try to count to $2 trillion because the U.S. has a massive budget, but some of it is mandatory spending. Musk has said he wants to, again, get to this magic number of $2 trillion that we keep talking about. But when it comes to the budget cuts, how much can the DOJ Commission actually do?
Well, as you guys were just pointing out, they don't have any actual authority to do any of this. This is an outside, what you call a blue ribbon commission, and this has been tried before, most recently and maybe famously with the Simpson-Bowles Commission a decade or so ago. These things have failed in the past, and the reason is because once you present these recommendations to people up on Capitol Hill, they say, that's great, but we're not going to take those recommendations because we like the spending that we're doing. Or it gets caught up in a debate about how much do you need to do revenue raisers, that is tax increases, and how much do you need to do by cutting spending. Every dollar, as you guys have just been pointing out, every dollar that Washington spends has a recipient out there somewhere in the country or somewhere around the world who likes that dollar being spent, who doesn't think it's waste, fraud, and abuse, and who has a member of Congress that they can talk to about it.
And I want to get you on the conflicts of interest piece of this, too, because specifics at this point are minimal. But one example is a recently approved $6 billion loan to Rivian, which is an electric car maker. And that's also a direct competitor to Elon Musk's Tesla. Does that raise some alarm bells to you?
Yeah, I asked Vivek Ramaswamy about this yesterday. I tried to get him to give us a specific, just anything, a line item of any kind over $10 billion that he would cut, and he wouldn't offer a specific. I tried to get him to say what it is that Donald Trump has told him are his priorities for cutting spending. He wouldn't offer a specific there either. And then I asked him about these Elon Musk conflicts of interest. Through SpaceX, Elon Musk is an enormous government contractor himself with the Pentagon and with NASA. He gets a lot of federal contracts. What if he's deciding that the contracts for his competitors are waste, fraud, and abuse, but the contracts for his companies are not waste, fraud, and abuse? Here's what Vivek Ramaswamy had to say about that.
Anybody who's offering recommendations, you should always have a skeptical lens to look at what are their motivations for making that recommendation. I say that's the best advice I'd give the public always. Be skeptical when somebody's making a recommendation. That being said, apply that standard 360 degrees. What do we have today? You have regulators who are regularly joining the industry. Is that they regulated? Is that a conflict of interest when they were making that decision as a regulator? Absolutely.
So he's talking about sort of the Washington swamp there, right? The idea that regulators go back into industry after they write the rules for that industry. You've got generals at the Pentagon who send contracts out to companies and then go serve on the board of those companies. So a lot of this is cultural and built into Washington. They're going to attack all that, and we'll see whether they're successful.
Yeah, there is that revolving door that often happens in this town. But when we look at some of the companies that are going to have a stake in this, the pharmaceutical industry, the defense contractors, that's just naming a few. Are they on board with these changes? What impacts are the reforms going to have on them, even if they're on board or not?
Well, naturally, they're not on board. They may say a whole bunch of things about it, but basically they want federal money. And it's interesting because Ramaswamy himself is a former pharmaceutical executive, right? And I asked him specifically about that sector yesterday. Do you think the drug companies are getting too much money from, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security? And what he was talking about was, sort of programmatic failures in those operations. So he's not talking about, cutting benefits to individuals, but he may be talking about the U.S. government overspending on drug companies, and that would impact those pharma companies.
Color me shocked that those various stakeholders don't necessarily want to see the spending rolled back. Eamon, thank you, and a great interview.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.